The walls around's carefully built image are beginning to shake, and this time it isn't the tabloids or faceless critics leading the charge. It's her own half-sister, a woman who refuses to stay silent and who has brought with her a tidal wave of accusations that could shatter the royal fairy tale for good. This isn't just about family disagreements or hurt feelings. No, what has stepped forward with goes much deeper. Claims so bold they reach into the heart of identity, her children, and the credibility of the monarchy itself. For years, presented herself as the outsider who broke through tradition, the woman who the odds and rewrote the rules of royalty. The radiant duchess, the devoted mother, the voice of resilience in a world of rigid formality. But according to that image isn't just exaggerated, it's entirely engineered, a performance scripted with precision and sold to the public as authenticity. And now, with allegations about family ties, her children, and even the very pregnancies that cemented her royal place, the polished facade is under its heaviest attack yet. This isn't about headlines or gossip columns anymore. This is about whether the story has told the world from her upbringing to her motherhood is even real at all. Insists that didn't just distance herself from her family. She erased them, rewriting her history like an actress revising a script to secure the perfect role. And if that wasn't explosive enough, a mystery woman has stepped forward, armed with documents and details that, if proven true, could ignite a constitutional storm unlike anything the monarchy has faced in modern history. The stakes couldn't be higher. Once built her empire on speaking her truth. But now silence has become her loudest answer, and to millions watching, that silence doesn't look like dignity, it looks like guilt. So the question is, what happens when the Duchess who once vowed to rewrite the story finds herself accused of writing the greatest fiction of them all? Stay tuned, because what comes next may change everything you thought you knew about her family and the future of the crown itself. The first grenade lobbed into this carefully built image didn't come from the press or the palace. It came from her half-sister, and didn't arrive with petty family complaints or vague gripes about being left out of the royal spotlight. No, she came with direct attacks aimed straight at its credibility, questioning not just her honesty, but the very identity she's spent years cultivating in front of the world. According to this entire story, from her so-called struggles to her role as a devoted daughter and glowing mother, is more performance than reality. She accuses of deliberately rewriting her past, not as a natural reinvention, but as an engineered narrative designed to hide inconvenient truths. Insize hasn't been the victim of a cruel media. She's been the architect of her own empire of illusion. And doesn't mince words. She claims has systematically erased her family from the public record, cutting ties, silencing voices, and painting herself as an only child when in reality she was not. For this wasn't just moving on, it was deleting her roots, wiping away anyone who could complicate the perfect story she wanted the world to believe. But it doesn't stop there. Goes further, striking at what she calls the crown jewel of deception, motherhood. She suggests story about her pregnancies and her picture-perfect role as a mother doesn't align with reality, calling it the boldest fabrication of all. For years, whispers circulated, but dragged those whispers into the spotlight, fueling suspicions that identity as a mother might be more illusion than fact. This wasn't a jealous sibling trying to ride on royal coattails. This was a calculated, relentless campaign to pull back the curtain, framed herself as the truth-teller, the one refusing to let carefully crafted script go unchallenged, and in doing so, she left with little room to hide. The impact was immediate. With every interview, every statement, accusations chipped away its image of authenticity. To the public had always stood for resilience, independence, and honesty. But claims flipped the narrative, painting not as the underdog who conquered the crown, but as a manipulator who staged her way into it. And just when the accusations seemed dramatic enough, the story detonated. Because out of nowhere, another figure stepped forward, a woman whose story didn't just challenge credibility, but threatened to shake the monarchy itself. Just once accusations were stirring headlines, the story escalated into something far bigger and far more dangerous for. Out of nowhere, a mystery woman identified only as DL stepped into the spotlight. But unlike the endless stream of gossip and speculation that usually surrounds the royals, DL didn't bring vague rumors. She brought something far more damning, documents, details, and claims so specific they couldn't be dismissed as idle chatter. DL's allegation was explosive. She said she wasn't just another voice in the crowd, she was the real surrogate behind royal pregnancies. According to her, the glowing public appearances staged, the baby bumps carefully displayed in designer coats were nothing more than smoke and mirrors. While was smiling for the cameras, DL claims she was the one carrying the royal heirs, isolated, silenced, and hidden away from the world. And she didn't arrive empty-handed. DL alleged she had hospital bills, medical records, and evidence of contracts signed under non-disclosure agreements. She painted a vivid picture of secret recruitment meetings in California, negotiations, and months of living in isolation, an experience that felt less like a pregnancy journey and more like imprisonment in a royal vault. Her story cut deep, DL described postpartum complications, mounting medical expenses, and the crushing loneliness of being erased from the narrative of children she says she brought into the world. And when her account was laid next to polished speeches about women's empowerment and authenticity, the contrast was staggering. To DL wasn't lifting women up, she was burying one under a gag order. At first, the claims seemed too wild to be taken seriously. Another conspiracy theory, perhaps. But then came the details, the precision of her accounts, and the evidence she claimed to hold. And suddenly, what once sounded like tabloid fodder became something that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. Because DL's allegations weren't just about staging a glowing royal motherhood, they carried a much bigger implication. If even part of her story was true, it could mean the royal succession itself was thrown into question. And when succession laws are at stake, the whispers stop being gossip and start becoming a constitutional crisis. With claims as explosive as DL's, most people expected Harry to respond immediately. A denial, a statement, maybe even the ultimate rebuttal, a DNA test to silence the whispers once and for all. But that never happened. Instead, the couple chose a path that only fueled the fire: silence. Not a carefully worded press release, not a public appearance to reassure the world. Nothing, just a void where answers should have been, and in the court of public opinion, silence doesn't look like strength, it looks like fear. To critics, it looked less like dignity and more like evasion, a deliberate refusal to confront questions that, if untrue, could have been dismissed in minutes. Even more puzzling was the legal strategy that followed. Reports claimed Harry and his legal team began firing off warning letters to media outlets, threatening action against anyone who amplified DL's allegations. But here's the catch: even as the lawyers threatened, Harry never once said the words that mattered most: "This is false." That silence became deafening. Because when you refuse to answer the simplest of questions, people begin to assume the answer isn't one you want to give. Instead of quelling the rumors, the couple's refusal to directly address them only poured gasoline on the fire. DL's story, once dismissed as far-fetched, suddenly seemed plausible to many simply because Harry wouldn't say otherwise. And then came the comparisons. Princess Diana, Kate both followed tradition, stepping outside the hospital just hours after giving birth, Bobby's in arms, offering the world undeniable proof. On the other hand, broke every script: no hospital steps, no immediate press briefing, no transparency about where or how the births even took place. At the time, it was framed as privacy, but in hindsight, with DL's accusations hanging in the air, it looked more like concealment. The silence wasn't just a PR misstep. It became a statement in itself, one that screamed louder than words ever could, and with every day that passed without clarity, suspicion grew. Critics weren't just asking whether had lied. They were beginning to question whether Harry was complicit, either knowingly protecting a secret or blindly living inside an illusion built for him. And that's when the whispers stopped being whispers. They became a roar, echoing across tabloids, social media, and dinner tables around the world. Because if Harry had nothing to hide, why leave the world guessing? For centuries, royal births have followed a ritual as old as the monarchy itself, a display of transparency meant to silence any doubts about lineage. Princess Diana set the modern standard when she stepped out of Mary's hospital just hours after giving birth, weary but radiant, holding William and then Harry in her arms. Kate followed suit with all three of her children, offering the same proof to the public, a clear, undeniable moment that left no room for speculation. But she broke every part of that tradition. There were no hospital steps, no smiling but exhausted appearance with Harry by her side, no immediate confirmation of where or even how the births happened. Instead, Harry wrapped the process in secrecy, insisting on privacy that might have looked admirable at the time, but now, in the shadow of DL's allegations, feels suspiciously like evasion. The secrecy only made things worse. Photos didn't add up, timelines seemed off, and the infamous folding belly clip footage that continues to circulate online gave critics more ammunition than ever. Instead of reassuring the public, every choice Harry made fed the theory that something wasn't right. What they called privacy looked, to many, like a deliberate cover-up. And here, where the illusion deepened. Carefully staged images of cradling her baby bump in designer coats became the centerpiece of her motherhood narrative. But if DL's story was even partially true, those moments weren't natural milestones, they were performances. Hollywood-level staging dressed up as royal reality. For royal watchers, the issue wasn't just about choices, it was about tradition. Royal motherhood had always been about continuity, proof, and transparency, a guarantee that the heirs to the throne were born in line with centuries of protocol. By breaking that pattern invited suspicion. And in a monarchy built on trust and appearances, breaking tradition isn't just unusual, it's dangerous. Because if's version of motherhood was theater, then it wasn't just her image at stake, it was the credibility of the crown itself. When whispers about pregnancies first began, most people dismissed them as tabloid noise. But DL's claims, paired with broken adherence to royal tradition, turned those whispers into something far more dangerous, a potential constitutional crisis. Because in the monarchy, lineage isn't just a matter of family pride, it's the very foundation on which the crown stands. For centuries, succession laws have been clear. Heirs must be born directly from the royal womb, witnessed and documented beyond dispute. It isn't about sentiment, it's about legitimacy. Diana's appearances after William and Harry's births weren't just symbolic, they were proof, evidence that secured the integrity of the royal bloodline. Kate followed the same script for a reason: transparency ensures stability. But in Harry, they tore that script apart. No clear hospital records, no public display, no transparency, just silence and secrecy wrapped in carefully staged PR. And if DL's story holds even a shred of truth, the implications are staggering. Because if Archie and were carried by a surrogate but presented as own children, that deception wouldn't just be personal. It would strike at the very legitimacy of the royal line. Think about it, royal bloodlines aren't built on stories or speeches, they're built on proof. If surrogacy happened and wasn't disclosed, critics argue it could destabilize the entire line of succession. Every royal birth is a link in a chain that stretches back centuries. Remove one link and the chain threatens to snap. And at the heart of it all are two innocent children. Archie didn't ask to be born into this storm. Yet if DL's allegations are true, they're caught in the middle of a constitutional nightmare, not because of who they are, but because of what might have been hidden about how they arrived. That's why this scandal isn't just another royal feud. It's not about family grudges or tabloid drama. It's about the survival of the monarchy's credibility. If staged her pregnancies, if the palace knowingly went along with it, then this isn't just deception. It's betrayal on a scale the crown may not be able to withstand. And that's what makes the silence so dangerous. Because every unanswered question doesn't just cast doubt on, it casts doubt on the monarchy itself. The moment DL's claims began to circulate and Harry's response wasn't transparency, it wasn't evidence, it wasn't even a firm denial. Instead, the Sussexes reached for their sharpest weapon: lawyers. Almost overnight, reports surfaced of the Sussex legal machine roaring to life. Letters went out to media outlets, threats were fired off to journalists. The message was clear: amplify the surrogate story and you'll pay the price. But here's the problem: in scandals like this, threats aren't the same as proof. Legal intimidation may muzzle newspapers, but it doesn't silence the internet, it doesn't silence whispers. If anything, it fuels them. And that's exactly what happened. Instead of crushing the allegations, the Sussexes' silence wrapped in legal muscle poured gasoline on the fire. Because in the court of public opinion, the absence of denial looks less like dignity and more like fear. Think about it, if the story were false, why not produce the records? Why not issue a simple "this is a lie, here's the truth"? Instead, they hid behind lawyers, and that decision sent a message louder than any tabloid headline ever could. To critics, the strategy looked not just weak, but hypocritical. This is the same couple that built an empire on authenticity, on telling their truth in explosive interviews and glossy Netflix documentaries. They positioned themselves as rebels against the palace machine, silenced by tradition, finally breaking free to speak openly. Yet when faced with the simplest of challenges, prove the surrogate story wrong, their voices vanished. PR experts tore the strategy apart. Legal warnings might scare editors, but they don't erase public doubt. In fact, they amplify it. Every day without a denial made DL's story sound less like a rumor and more like a suppressed reality. And that's the irony: the Sussexes built their brand on truth, but in this moment, silence became their loudest confession. For in Harry, this wasn't just bad press. It was a PR war they were losing, and every legal letter sent without proof only deepened the cracks in their once unshakable brand. Once the silence dragged on, the tide began to shift. At first, and Harry's defenders dismissed the allegations as conspiracy chatter, the kind of wild theories that swirl around every public figure. But as days turned into weeks with no denial, public opinion began to turn, and brutally so. Polls revealed a sobering reality. More and more people were willing to believe DL's story over carefully curated narrative. The glossy empire the Sussexes built, interviews, documentaries, speeches about authenticity, suddenly looked flimsy, like a house of cards caught in a storm. Every polished photo, every heartfelt, was replayed under a harsher light. What once felt like empowerment now looked suspiciously like performance. The fallout wasn't just external. Behind the scenes, whispers of tension between and Harry grew louder. Insiders painted a picture of a couple under siege, not from tabloids this time, but from the slow collapse of their own credibility. Brand as the bold duchess rewriting royal traditions started to erode, while Harry's reputation as the rebel prince began to crumble under accusations of complicity. And through it all, never missed her chance to twist the knife. Every interview, was another opportunity to hammer home her narrative. Wasn't silenced, she was the architect of her own deception. This wasn't karma, it was exposure. The fairy tale her sister built brick by brick was falling apart, and she wanted the world to see the wreckage. The silence, meant to protect and Harry, had become the loudest verdict against them. What began as whispers of family drama had snowballed into a credibility crisis with global implications. Wasn't content to let DL's claims dominate the conversation. She seized the moment to unleash her own arsenal of accusations, and she came armed with details only a sister could know. For this wasn't about gossip or envy. It was about dismantling the image had carefully crafted brick by brick. In her telling didn't simply drift from family, she erased them. Interviews where claimed she grew up as an only child branded those words a deliberate lie. To her hadn't lost her father, she had deliberately iced him out. Every glossy interview, every humanitarian photo op, every carefully staged scene of the Duchess as a self-made outsider argued was nothing more than propaganda. Her attacks cut deep because they weren't abstract. They weren't whispers from distant palace insiders. They were claims from someone who had lived the story firsthand, positioned herself not as a bitter relative clamoring for attention, but as the truth-teller finally tearing away the mask. In her version of events, wasn't a victim of the press, she was the director of her own false empire. The more spoke, the harder it became for defenders to wave it all away as noise. Here was a sister pointing directly at contradictions, pointing to interviews, pointing to inconsistencies that were already under the microscope. And in an environment where DL's allegations were gaining momentum, words landed like fuel on a fire. Her narrative was merciless, wasn't rewriting the rules of royalty, she was rewriting her own backstory, and in doing so claimed she had turned family ties into collateral damage. Just when the storm seemed to peak, another voice entered the chaos, and this one didn't whisper. A woman known only as DL came forward not with vague allegations, but with receipts that sent shockwaves through every corner of the royal watching world. Hospital bills, medical records, whispers of a lockdown non-disclosure agreement. Her claim, she was the real surrogate behind royal pregnancies. DL wasn't speculating about timelines or gossiping about photos. She described vivid recruitment meetings in California, contracts inked in private back rooms, and months of isolation that felt less like an honored arrangement and more like imprisonment. According to her, while walked red carpets and designer coats, smiling with a perfect baby bump, DL carried the true weight of royal heirs, alone, erased, and silenced. The contrast was brutal. The Duchess basked in cameras, cradling her bump for millions to see, while DL claimed her reality unfolded in hidden clinics away from the world's eyes. She painted a portrait of betrayal, promises of privacy and compensation that turned into silence and abandonment. If even fragments of her story were true, royal motherhood wasn't a celebration of life, but the most carefully choreographed performance of her career. What made DL's allegations so chilling was their specificity. She didn't just say she was involved. She described postpartum complications, medical bills piling up, and the crushing loneliness of carrying two royal heirs while being erased from the narrative entirely. Suddenly, some empowering speeches about women's voices rang hollow, almost mocking, when laid against DL's tale of being buried under secrecy and denial. This wasn't another nameless troll behind a keyboard. This was a woman who claimed she had lived it, and the documents she hinted at were enough to make people stop and wonder, if story was flawless, why did DL's account sound so painfully real? With allegations this explosive, most public figures would have rushed to shut them down. A firm denial, a DNA test, even a single clear statement could have crushed the speculation overnight. But Harry didn't do that. Instead, they chose silence, a silence so heavy it began to sound like confirmation. Critics pointed out the irony. This was the couple who built their empire on speaking their truth, the ones who gave interviews, documentaries, and books to ensure their voices were never silenced. Yet now, when faced with questions about the very foundation of their family, their voices vanished. It wasn't the palace silencing them, it wasn't the tabloids blocking them. It was their own decision to stay quiet, and that choice raised more suspicion than any rumor ever could. Even Harry, once hailed as the rebel prince who never backed down from confrontation, now looked like either a partner in deception or a pawn in carefully managed narrative. Did he know the truth all along, or was he just another character in her script? Either way, the refusal to address the claims made him appear complicit. For the public, silence doesn't equal dignity, it screams secrecy. And the more Harry avoided the questions, the more the world began to wonder, if there was truly nothing to hide, why let the rumors spiral unchecked? What should have been a straightforward denial became a PR disaster, one that made their carefully built image of honesty and transparency look like smoke and mirrors. Royal births aren't just family milestones, they're national events, steeped in centuries of ritual and transparency. Princess Diana walked out of Mary's hospital mere hours after giving birth, tired but radiant, a newborn in her arms for the world to see. Kate did the same 3 times, embodying the tradition that heirs must be publicly presented without secrecy or delay. But she shattered every expectation. No hospital steps, no official photo call, no royal physician confirming the birth. Instead, there was silence, confusion, and a carefully managed PR rollout that left more questions than answers. Dates didn't line up, photos seemed off, and then came the infamous folding belly clip, footage so bizarre it continues to haunt narrative to this day. Critics argued wasn't embracing privacy. She was staging her own version of motherhood like a Hollywood production, complete with props, perfect camera angles, and rehearsed moments. The monarchy, built on tradition, doesn't handle broken patterns well, and choices weren't just unconventional, they were unprecedented. Every time the palace avoided explaining the gaps, suspicion only deepened. To royal watchers, it looked less like privacy and more like evasion. And in the monarchy, evasion breeds conspiracy. Because when the rituals that proved legitimacy for centuries suddenly vanish, people start asking why. At the heart of the monarchy lies one unshakable principle: legitimacy. Royal heirs aren't just children, they're living symbols of centuries-old lineage, carrying the bloodline that secures the crown's future. And when there's even a shadow of doubt over that legitimacy, the entire institution trembles. That's why pregnancies, cloaked in secrecy, riddled with unanswered questions, and now burdened with DL's explosive claims, strike deeper than tabloid scandal. If her children weren't carried in line with royal protocol, if surrogacy was involved but never disclosed, critics argue it could destabilize the very line of succession itself. In the monarchy, there are no half-truths. The rules demand absolute clarity. Either the children meet centuries of tradition or the narrative collapses. And this isn't just theoretical. Imagine Archie and caught at the center of a constitutional storm, their futures questioned not because of who they are, but because of what may have been hidden about how they arrived. In the monarchy, tradition dictates heirs are born from the royal womb, documented and witnessed beyond dispute. But story breaks that chain, NDAs, secrecy, and vanishing details have replaced transparency. Even insiders began voicing concerns. Whispers of unease spread about whether and Harry's actions could cast a shadow over the crown's stability. Some warned that the couple's choices weren't just reckless, they were dangerous, potentially sowing seeds of crisis for generations to come. And in the end, the monarchy doesn't deal in speculation. It deals in absolutes. If narrative doesn't hold, the entire institution faces a legitimacy question unlike any in modern history. When the accusations reached their boiling point and Harry didn't step up with proof, they didn't offer clarity, transparency, or even a heartfelt denial. Instead, they unleashed their legal team, a machine known for its ferocity. Letters flew to media outlets warning them to tread carefully or face consequences. Journalists were threatened, networks were pressured, and lawyers worked overtime to muzzle anyone amplifying DL's claims. But here's the catch: while the threats came fast, the denials never did. Not once did Harry issue a straightforward statement saying, "This is false, here's the evidence." Instead, their silence lingered while their lawyers swung wildly in the background. To many, it felt less like a couple defending their truth and more like a desperate attempt to scare the story into disappearing. The irony wasn't lost on the public. This was the duo who branded themselves as champions of truth, who built an empire on tell-all interviews and authenticity campaigns. Yet when faced with the simplest of challenges, disprove the surrogate story they didn't speak, they hid behind legal threats. PR experts were quick to call it a disaster. Lawyers might silence newspapers, but they can't silence the internet. Whispers online grew louder, fueled by the very absence of denial. In fact, the Sussexes' legal blitz only made DL's story sound more credible, as though something dangerous was being hidden rather than disproved. And that's the brutal irony. For a couple who claimed to fight for openness, their silence wrapped in legal intimidation spoke volumes. In the court of public opinion, that silence sounded less like strength and more like fear. At first, Harry's strategy of silence might have seemed like control, but the longer it dragged on, the more it looked like collapse. Polls began shifting, with public trust in the Sussexes sinking faster than ever before. People who once applauded their fight for authenticity now questioned whether that image had been built on lies. The glossy Netflix documentaries, the sit-down, the countless speeches about truth and resilience, all of it was dragged back into the spotlight, but this time under suspicion. What once looked like empowerment began to feel like performance. Every carefully staged photo, every polished anecdote, every moment Harry had sold as their real story was now being replayed through the lens of doubt. Behind palace walls and in Hollywood boardrooms, whispers grew louder. The Sussex brand, once untouchable, was showing cracks. Insiders described a couple under siege, not just from critics or tabloids, but from their own unraveling credibility. The public that once defended them so fiercely was slipping away. And in the middle of it all, made sure her voice carried. She positioned herself as the one who had called this downfall all along, a sister who warned that carefully controlled narrative couldn't hold forever. For her, this wasn't karma, it was exposure. The fairy tale wasn't just breaking, it was collapsing in real time. By the time the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore, and Harry's silence had become the loudest statement of all. What started as whispers of family drama had snowballed into something far greater, a potential constitutional question, a PR disaster, and a collapse of credibility no Netflix deal could polish away. The Duchess, who once presented herself as a symbol of resilience and reinvention, now stood accused of authoring the greatest royal fiction of modern times. Every unanswered question felt like confirmation. Every legal threat without denial made the silence heavier. And every passing day without clarity chipped away at the image had spent years building. For it was vindication. For DL, it was exposure, and for the public, it was betrayal. The narrative fought so hard to control was no longer hers. It belonged to the growing chorus of doubt, suspicion, and unanswered questions that refused to fade. The tragedy wasn't just the fall of a public figure, it was the unraveling of a story that had once inspired millions. And Harry had positioned themselves as modern royals rewriting tradition. But now they looked less like rebels shaping history and more like actors clinging to a fading script. And the twist of all, that silence, deliberate, strategic, and unbroken, became the final verdict in the court of public opinion. Because when the truth is absent, people fill the void themselves. And the verdict they've chosen is far harsher than anything could have feared. So here we are, accusations cut deep, DL's alleged surrogate story detonated, and in Harry's silence still hangs heavy like a verdict. What began as whispers of family drama has spiraled into a storm that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. And if this silence continues, the illusion worked so hard to protect may finally collapse for good. But this saga doesn't end here. Because if you thought today's revelations were explosive, wait until you hear the secret Tom Bower uncovered, a revelation that left absolutely furious and could expose even more cracks in her carefully controlled image. This is Gossip File, where we dig into the stories others are too afraid to touch. And trust me, the next chapter isn't just darker, it changes everything. Stay tuned.